Hello everyone! Today, I'm going over a budget commander deck that I've brewed around Xur, Eternal Schemer. As usual, I've designed this deck to list for less than $45 at the time of recording, using prices listed by Scryfall, which includes our basic lands at 10 cents each, but as a list price, it doesn't include costs such as shipping. Anyway, Xur, Eternal Schemer is a 1/4 legendary human wizard with flying that costs a white, blue, and black to cast, and gives enchantment creatures you control Death Touch, Lifelink, and Hexproof, while also having an activated ability costing 1 and a white to turn a non-aura enchantment you control into a creature in addition to its other types, with base power and toughness equal to its mana cost. Which, Xur honestly gives some pretty potent keywords, and given his activated ability doesn't include tapping Xur, it gives us a lot of options to hold mana back and threaten interaction, and still be able to turn our enchantments into Death Touch creatures with protection as wanted or needed. But I'm getting ahead of myself. As you might guess, in general, this deck is going to include a crap ton of enchantments, trying to slot them into as many of your deck veggie slots and synergistic pieces as possible to maximize on Xur's static ability, and giving us plenty of options to use his activated ability. A good chunk of this deck will be enchantment creatures, as they just automatically get Xur's keyword gifts just for simply existing, making creatures that already had useful effects even more powerful. But we'll also have a bunch of regular enchantments for anthems, draw, and exiling our opponent's more important permanents, and the like. And while somewhat tertiary, we can use the life gain that we get from the lifelink Xur grants to use as another angle of attack. Though ultimately, we're looking to have a wide board of enchantment creatures with a range of painful effects, for our opponents, that are scary to block or attack into, while also being hard to get rid of with that hexproof. But let's get into the 99 of this deck, starting with our ramp. Starting with Wayfarer's Bauble, a 1-drop that we can sack to tutor a basic land onto the battlefield tapped. Arcane Signet as a mana rock tapping for any color we could need. And then Dimir, Orzhov, and Azorius Signets, turning any 1 mana into 2 mana of their respective named colored pairs. And given our commander is just a 3-drop, but we'll be casting a ton of enchantments, we have some cost reducers such as Starfield Mystic, Inquisitive Glimmer, Starnheim Courser, and Sten, Paranoid Partisan, as ways to make our enchantments cost 1 less to cast. Now with that, I'd like to go over our various enchantments and enchantment creatures in this deck with useful effects but didn't fit into one of the deck veggie sections. Starting with our enchantment creatures, Spirited Companion is a 1/1 that we can easily get out early, and, as it has us draw as it enters, it can help a bit in maintaining some momentum while also benefiting from getting our commander out. Grim Guardian is a 1/4 that has each opponent lose 1 life when it or another enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, while Nightmare Shepherd is a 4/4 flyer that lets you make a token copy of a non-token creature you control when they die by exiling that creature, though the token is a 1/1 Nightmare along with its other types, though as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, if an enchantment turned into a creature by Xur dies with Nightmare Shepherd on the field, the copy that Shepherd makes doesn't see Xur's effect, and instead, that copy comes back as a regular enchantment again, so it won't be a 1/1 nor a Nightmare. But since mana costs are copyable values, you should be able to turn that copy enchantment back into an enchantment creature with the same power and toughness as the original you did with Xur. Demon of Fate's Design is a 6/6 with flying and trample, so that's scary to combo with the Death Touch, that lets you cast an enchantment spell by paying life equal to its mana value instead of paying its mana cost once per each of your turns, of which Xur giving our enchantment creatures lifelink should help with getting some of that life total back up. Aetherios, Shadow Veiled, is a 4/7 with Indestructible, but isn't a creature until your devotion to white and black is at least 7, that has you put a coin counter on another target creature on your end step, and whenever a creature with a coin counter dies or is put into exile, you return that card to the battlefield under your control. Then moving to just enchantments, Sigil of the Empty Throne makes a 4/4 angel token with flying whenever you cast an enchantment. Painful Quandary has opponents lose either 5 life or discard a card whenever they cast a spell, and Sanguine Bond has it so whenever you gain life, a target opponent loses that much life. And then we have Copy Enchantment and Estrid's Invocation, both of which you may have enter the battlefield as a copy of an enchantment, though the latter only those you control. But Estrid's Invocation also lets you exile it on your upkeep and return it to its owner's control to basically let you copy something else on top of its copied values. Then we have Ethereal Armor and all that glitters, auras mostly intended for Xur, as they give the enchanted creature +1/+1 for each enchantment you control, though Ethereal Armor also gives it first strike, and all that glitters also gives +1/+1 for each artifact you control. Now with that, I'd like to move on to some spells that buff our board en masse. Starting with Always Watching, a 3-drop that gives your non-token creatures you control +1/+1 in Vigilance, and Ethereal Absolution, which gives your creatures +1/+1 and your opponent's creatures -1/-1, while also giving you a bit of access to some graveyard hate. Celestial Ancient has you put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control whenever you cast an enchantment spell, though it isn't an enchantment itself unfortunately, though Nykthos Paragon is, and has it so whenever you gain life, you may put that many +1/+1 counters on each creature you control, though you can only do this once per turn. Archetype of Courage and Archetype of Imagination are 2/2 and 3/2 enchantment creatures, giving our creatures First Strike and Flying, respectively, while also preventing our opponent's creatures from having or gaining those respective keywords. Heliod, God of the Sun, is a 5/6 enchantment creature with Indestructible, though not a creature unless your devotion to white is at least 5, that gives your other creatures Vigilance and gives you a source of enchantment creature tokens. And finally, Soaring Lightbringer is a 4/5 with Flying that gives your other enchantment creatures Flying, and thankfully Zur already has that. And whenever you attack a player, you create a 1/1 White Glimmer enchantment creature token that's tapped and attacking that player. But now let's move on and start talking about our main sources of card advantage. Starting with some non-permanents with Sign in Blood, having you draw 2 and lose 2 life, Read the Bones to scry 2, draw 2, and lose 2 life, and Pull from Tomorrow to have you draw X and then discard 1, with X being part of the mana spent casting it. And then we have Cosmos Elixir, which has you draw on your end step if your life total is higher than your starting, or otherwise, you gain 2 life. Entity Tracker, which has you draw whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield under your control. And Mesa Enchantress, which has you draw whenever you cast an enchantment. Then Reconnaissance Mission, Coastal Piracy, and Bindings of Thassa are enchantments that let you draw whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player. Greed lets you pay a black mana and 2 life to draw, while Phyrexian Arena has you draw 1 and lose a life at the beginning of your upkeep. And then while not directly draw, Thought Reflection has it so if you would draw a card, you draw 2 instead. Then while these aren't exactly draw, they seem like the best place to put these two, so Aminatau, Veil Piercer, is a 2/4 that has you Surveil 2 at the beginning of your upkeep, but gives the enchantments in your hand Miracle, letting it be cast for an alternative casting cost if it's the first card you drew that turn, with the Miracle cost being its mana cost reduced by 4 generic mana. So she lets you filter for an enchantment to draw and then cast that enchantment on the cheap. While Zur, the Enchanter, kinda breaks my soft rule around non-land tutors, as he's a 1/4 that has you tutor for an enchantment with mana value 3 or less and put it onto the battlefield whenever he attacks. But now let's move on to the ways that we can interact with what our opponents are doing. For this deck I didn't lean too hard into counter magic since I mostly wanted enchantments, but we do still have Counterspell for a general counterspell, and Negate to counter a non-creature spell. And then we have Void Rend to deal with a pesky permanent, and Swords to exile a target creature. But moving on from general staples, I've put in a handful of exiling enchantments such as Prayer of Binding, which exile a non-land permanent on entering, which remains in exile until the enchantment leaves the battlefield, which normally wouldn't be so great, but given that we can turn these into hexproof death touch creatures with reasonable strength and toughness, these act as both interaction that, aside from the commanders, could still be somewhat hard to deal with, and a way to widen our board. And then going along with Prayer of Binding is Seal from Existence, coming with some inbuilt protection of Ward 3 before we make it a hexproof creature. And then there's Banishing Light and Borrowed Time, exiling a non-land permanent for 3. Static Snare is a 5-drop with Flash, exiling an opponent's creature or artifact until it leaves the battlefield, but it costs 1 less to cast for each attacking creature, so definitely best used on a combat phase. And Grasp of Fate exiles a non-land permanent for each of our opponents until it leaves the battlefield for 3. And then moving away from exile, Doomwake Giant is a 4/6 enchantment creature that gives our opponent's creatures -1/-1 for the turn whenever it or another enchantment enters the battlefield under your control. And then moving on to some more protection-esque effects, Propaganda and Ghostly Prison are enchantments that make it expensive for our opponents to swing at us, costing 2 generic per creature swung our way, while Sphere of Safety does the same, but instead of 2, our opponents pay mana equal to the number of enchantments we control for each creature swung our way. Then Elcid of Life's Bounty is a 1/1 enchantment creature that we can sack to give another creature or enchantment we control protection from a color of our choice for the turn. And Curator's Ward is an aura that gives our enchanted permanent hexproof, and if that permanent was historic, you can draw a card when it leaves the battlefield. And then wrapping up with a couple of wipes, we have Extinguish All Hope to destroy all non-enchantment creatures, and Austere Command, letting you choose 2 between destroying all artifacts, all enchantments, all creatures with mana value 3 or less, or all creatures with mana value 4 or greater. But now that we've gone through all the spells in this deck, let's go over our land base. Starting with some land tutor lands, we have Shire Terrace, Promising Vein, and Esper Panorama, all entering untapped and producing generic, but can be sacked to tutor any basic land we could want in this deck. And then Command Tower, Path of Ancestry, and Arcane Sanctum will tap for any color we can need, though the latter two do enter tapped. Exotic Orchard is likely to tap for at least one of our colors. And then moving on to duels, we have Caves of Kolios, tapping for a generic, or getting a black or white at the cost of pinging ourselves for one, while Prairie Stream is an Azorius slow land, and Sky Cloud Expanse turns 1 mana into a white and a blue mana. Shine Shadow Snarl, Port Town, and Choked Estuary are reveal lands of our 3 color pairs, entering untapped if you reveal a land from your hand with a basic land type of the colors the reveal land taps for. Then I put in the Thriving lands with Thriving Heath, Isle, and Moor, which naturally tap for white, blue, and black, respectively, but let you choose the second color it could tap for as it enters the battlefield to help with color fixing. And then for some scry lands, we have Temple of Deceit, Enlightenment, and Silence. And aside from that, we'll fill the rest of this deck with 9 plains, 5 islands, and 5 swamps, as we'll want a bit of extra access to white, both from pip frequency of what we're casting, and for Xur's activated ability. And now that we've gone through all 100 cards in this deck, let's take a look at that price. And as you can see here, this deck is currently listing right around $44 at the time of recording, which does include our basic lands at 10 cents each, but as a list price, this doesn't include costs such as shipping. Now before closing out this video, I'd like to quickly go over some cards you may wish to consider if you're looking to build this deck with a higher budget. Starting with some Anthem type effects, we have Brave the Sands, giving our creatures vigilance and letting them block an additional creature each combat, which combines nicely with the Death Touch. Boon of the Spirit Realm, which gets a blessing counter whenever it or another enchantment enters under your control, and creatures you control get +1/+1 for each blessing counter on Boon of the Spirit Realm. And Hallowed Haunting gives your creatures flying and vigilance if you control 7 or more enchantments, and whenever you cast an enchantment, you create a white spirit cleric token with power and toughness equal to the number of spirits you control. Court of Vantress is significantly better than the other enchantment cloning spells we have, as it first makes you the Monarch when it enters, which you might be able to reasonably defend with enough Death Touch enchantments, but at the beginning of your upkeep, you can choose another artifact or enchantment, and if you're the Monarch, you can make a token copy of that, and if you aren't, Court of Vantress can become a copy of the target, but with the copy ability maintained. For a couple more effects to make us even more unattractive to swing at, there's Dissipation Field to make it so whenever a permanent deals damage to you, not just combat damage, it gets returned to its owner's hand, and No Mercy, which makes it so whenever a creature deals damage to you, also not just combat damage, it gets destroyed. Runetail, Kitsune Ascendant, is a 2/2 that gets flipped whenever you have 30 or more life, and it turns into Runetail's Essence, an enchantment that prevents all damage that would be dealt to creatures you control. Leyline of Anticipation can let us hold back mana a lot more freely, as we can cast spells as though they had flash, and we can start the game with a spell on the field if it's in our opening hand. And finally, Enchanted Evening and Secret Arcade are enchantments that turn permanents into enchantments in addition to their other types, with the former affecting all permanents, not just our own, and the latter only affecting our non-land permanents and the permanent spells we control. But it also has Dusty Parlor to unlock, which has you put +1/+1 counters on a target creature equal to an enchantment's mana value whenever you cast one. But I'm gonna close out this video, so if you'd like to build, adapt, upgrade, or otherwise play with this deck, the link, as always, is in the description down below. And if you made it this far, maybe drop the video a like and consider subbing to the channel. But regardless, thank you for watching, have fun in your games, and I'll see you in the next one.